Hello. In this project I'm making this planter for a member of the family who's a keen gardener. The material I'm going to be using is this hardwood, which I rescued from a broken garden table a couple of years ago. The material looks like it's in a terrible state, so the first thing I'm going to do is clean it up a little by passing it through my thicknesser. Usually I would use a plane for this kind of job, but the thicknesser is a recent addition to my workshop, so this was a great excuse to try it out. It may look terribly weathered, but the wood has been in my wood store inside for a couple of years now, so I do know it's completely dry. I feed everything through the thicknesser, taking off a very small amount with each pass. And this is the result. After a couple of passes on each side, the wood's actually looking quite nice. Next, I look through the pieces to see what I've got available and calculate the cuts I'll need to do to make the component parts. For the ends of the planter, I'm going to need to laminate 3 pieces together to get the required width. I start by cutting off the old tenons and, in doing so, cut the boards to the same length. I cut off the scrap ends of this third board, which had screw holes in it, and then cut it to the same length as the other 2 boards. Placing the boards side by side, we can see that there are gaps along the joins. This will need sorting out before we laminate. To do this, I'm going to put the pieces together and plane them. I line them up as best I can and clamp them in the vise together. To start cleaning up the edges, I start planing with my scrub plane. This is just a number 4 plane, which I have designated for doing dirtier work, and in which I have fitted a cutting iron with a rounded leading edge. The main purpose of a scrub plane is usually to take off a lot of material, but I'm using it here because the edges of these boards are pretty manky and I don't want to over abuse my nice Stanley number 4. With most of the mess cleaned off, I'll change tools and use my favourite number 4. Here I've got quite a shallow set. This is just to finish things off and make sure I've got a very nice edge. With one edge completely prepared, I can use this to square up the wood, rotate it in the vise and clean up the other side. Again, I'll start with my scrub plane and then finish off with my smoothing plane. And tidy away the shavings. The finished pieces look pretty nice. And when placed side by side, make a nice join with no gaps. I've already set my sash clamps to the desired width. I place the boards in there in the orientation I'm going to laminate them together. One of the boards is slightly fainter, so I've put this one in the middle because I think it's more aesthetically pleasing. I place glue along the edge of the board, flip it over and then slide the edges back and forth together. This helps to distribute the glue. You can feel a resistance build up as the glue starts to grab. I then repeat the exact same process with the next board. With the boards in position, I start to tighten the clamps, doing a little bit on each side so as not to over-compress one side and knock the finished piece out of square. As I apply pressure, I constantly check to make sure that the surfaces of the board are still in line. And I wipe off any glue squeeze out as I go. With the first clamps fully tightened, I add 2 more over the top of the piece. This helps to distribute the pressure and minimise the possibility of bowing. Once clamped up, I flip the whole piece over and remove any glue squeeze out from the bottom side. I then leave everything clamped up for the glue to cure. While the end is gluing up, I turn my attention to the pieces that are going to provide the length of the planter. I'm going to need 2 pieces of equal length for the side, and for the bottom a piece which is slightly shorter. However, to make things easier at this stage, I'll cut 3 pieces exactly the same length. Again, I start by cutting any waste off the end of the boards, and then cut all 3 to uniform length. I'm using my chop saw here, but it wouldn't take much more effort to cut all these to length using a tenon saw. And here are my pieces. I choose the 2 pieces which I'm going to use for the sides and put the bottom piece to one side for now. Once everything is glued up, I can remove the clamps. The gluing time will depend on the type of glue you use. I actually left this to glue up overnight, so I am confident that the glue is completely cured. Next, I'm going to tidy up these laminated boards. I start by using a card scraper to remove any remaining glue. Then I move on to using my smoothing plane to completely flatten the board. I then finish with the final pass with the card scraper. Planing and scraping severely reduces the amount of sanding that will have to be done later. Next, I want to make the 2 ends out of this single laminated board. I clamp a block to my crosscut sled to act as a length stop. Then, rather than trying to accurately cut the board in half in one go, I deliberately set the stop so I'm going to cut slightly shorter than half the length of the board. Once cut, I can remove this first piece, slide over the remainder of the board and make a uniform cut. I now know that both pieces are exactly the same length. And here they are. Perfectly matched. With all my basic components cut to size, I'll start to arrange them in a rough assembly, just to get an idea of the scope. And things are going to come together something like this, with the edge pieces about halfway up the end boards. The next job is to tidy up the edges of the length pieces. This is done in exactly the same way as when we prepared the edge pieces for lamination. The only difference here is I'm using a slightly longer plane. This just makes it easier to ensure that the edges are flat along the entire length. And that's the length pieces all planed and ready to use. Because of the recycled nature of this wood, there are a few blemishes and holes, so I just go ahead and fill in some of those holes using some wood filler. This is fine on a project like this, which is a fairly rustic garden piece. It's not an approach I would advocate for a piece of internal fine furnishing. When the filler is dried, I sand it flat. The end result is certainly good enough for a piece of garden furniture. Next, I want to cut the end pieces to shape. I want to do this together to make sure they're uniform, so I'll use some double-sided tape to stick the pieces together while I work. I want to add a simple slope to the ends. I'm going to mark this up simply by measuring in an equal distance from each corner on the bottom edge and then drawing a line between this mark and the top corner. I'll make the initial cut on each side using the bandsaw, sawing as close to the line as I can. I've managed to cut fairly accurately with the bandsaw, but in order to make sure that the angles are completely flat, I'll use my plane. Here I can tell I'm planing against the grain, so I rotate the workpiece in the vise. And that's much better. I plane both edges until they're completely flat, and I can use my original pencil line as a guide. With the shaping completed, I can split the two pieces and remove the tape. This mostly peels off fairly easily, although at times I have used some cellulose thinners to remove any remaining stickiness. Next, it's time to start cutting the joints. I'm going to use dovetail joints along the edge pieces to give the piece some lateral strength. This will stop the ends pulling away from each other. I could measure the thickness of the end pieces in order to mark up the required depth of the tails. However, I prefer to set my gauge to the width of the end piece. That way I know I'm getting a uniform measurement when I come to mark out. I then use the gauge to mark in the depth of each tail on one side of each end of the wood. Using my square and marking knife, I reference the gauge mark and scribe an accurate mark along the entire width of the board. I'm only doing this on one side, because with a dovetail joint one side of the wood will be on show. Once I've marked up one board, I place the opposite board against it, line up the edges and then transfer the mark. This is because the most important thing about these two rails is that the internal distance between the two end pieces is uniform on both sides. This is essential for the whole piece to be square. I repeat this process on the other end. Note that I've put the square on the other side. This is because I'm always referencing from the same edge. That means if there is a discrepancy between the squareness on the top and bottom edge, the position of the marking lines will still be uniform. Again, I transfer the mark from one board to the other. Placing the boards next to each other, we can see that these lines match perfectly, and thus the internal distance is going to be uniform. Next, I want to trace this mark onto all sides of the board. On the top and the bottom, I'm going to do this with a knife mark, because they won't be seen. But on the outside face of the board, I'll use a pencil. Next I want to mark where the top of the dovetails are going to be. To do this I mark in an equal distance from each edge of the board. With the dimension of the wood I was using, an inset of about 20mm or 3/4 of an inch seemed about right. With these distances marked in, I use my dovetail gauge to mark in the angles. I'm using this template guide because I have it to hand. It's just as easy to use a bevel gauge. I have a future video project planned which will use dovetail joints. In that one I'll give a little bit more explanation and show some more alternatives for marking out. Next I transfer the position for the end of the tails onto the end of the board. I can then use the dovetail template once more to mark in the lines on the other side of the board. And that's our first dovetail marked out. This process is then repeated to mark out the remaining 3 tails. The shoulder of the joint requires a cross cut, so I'm going to use my knife to cut the fibres to make for a neater saw cut. I'm also going to put a knife mark on each edge. This will help when I come to saw down the shoulders. Using a chisel, I cut into the edge of the board up against the knife mark. This creates a notch on the waist side of the line. I use this notch to help position the saw in the correct place when I start cutting the shoulder. I then cut down across the board until I meet the bottom of the angled tail mark. I flip the board over in the vise and repeat the process from the other side. First creating the notch, and then sawing down along the board until I meet the angled line. I then reposition the piece in the vise, ready to cut the angles for the tail. First of all, however, I want to make a notch in the top to help start the saw. I start by using my knife to make the mark across the top of the board. And then, using a chisel, I make a notch. Cutting into the end grain with a chisel is harder, so I use my mallet rather than just pushing with my hand. I then position my saw in this notch and take a couple of strokes to help seat the saw. I then re-angle the saw so it's in line with my angle mark and saw down until I meet the corner where I cut the shoulder. And there we go. Incidentally, the saw I'm using for this is a specialist dovetail saw, but you can use a tenon saw to do this. A dovetail saw is the same kind of anatomy as a tenon saw, except it has a thinner saw plate and usually a much higher teeth per inch ratio. And that's our first tail cut. I then repeat this process to cut the rest of the tails. You may notice that, because I'm right-handed, I tend to rotate the piece in the vise so that the waste material is also on the right-hand side. This makes it easier for me to cut on the waste side of the line. And that's the first side piece completely cut. I then repeat the process for the second side, so I have 2 uniform pieces. Next, I need to mark the end pieces so that I can cut the sockets for the dovetails. I start by finding the vertical centre of the end. Then I measure the depth of the side piece. And then on the end I measure half the depth either side of the central line. And this ensures that my piece will be in the middle. And a quick check with the ruler confirms it is. I'm going to use my combination square as a gauge. So I set the distance from the square edge to match the depth of the bottom edge of the side piece. I can then use this to mark the bottom edge of the board across the face of the end. I put both end pieces in the vise together and mark up that bottom edge of the sideboard. This is to make sure that everything is marked up in the same position on both ends, so that everything keeps nice and square when assembled. Placing one end piece back in the vise, I place one of the edge boards against the bottom mark so that I can ensure that I mark the socket for the dovetail in the correct position. I use a square to ensure that the side piece is running perpendicular to the end. I then use my knife to mark in the angles of the dovetail. By marking up the socket using the actual dovetail that is going to fit in the socket, I can make sure that each cut is bespoke. This gives me a better degree of accuracy than if I marked everything up beforehand, as that requires complete accuracy in my markup. Likewise, I use the thickness of one of the edge pieces to mark up the depth of the socket. All that remains is for me to join up the mark on the edge of the board with the depth mark using a square. Which I do on both the front and the back of the end. I clearly mark up where the waste material is to be removed to avoid me making any silly mistakes. Because some of the cuts for the sockets are essentially cross-cuts, I'm going to use my knife and score in to cut the fibres. This will make for a much neater cut. The knife also provides a much more accurate cutting reference than a pencil mark. In order to mark in the bottom edge of the socket, I use my bevel gauge. I set it to the angle of the edge and then move it in until a reference point I just marked in by marking up the edge of the board. I then use my knife to mark in this bottom edge. This is particularly important as I'm going to be chiselling down here, and so I want to have a nice clean edge to work with. I then put the piece in the vise, ready to start removing the material. As per usual, I use a chisel to make a sawing groove. I then saw on the waist side of the line down to the depth mark. I repeat this on both sides of the socket. To remove the waste material, I'm going to use a chisel. I start by making a notch inset from the knife line. As you can see, the fibres behind the chisel move back. So, by starting my cut in front of the chisel line, I can ensure that I'm not making the socket deeper than it should be. I'll start by removing most of the material and then tidy up back to the knife line when there is less material to make resistance to the bevel of the chisel. After removing a small amount from the end, I chisel down further. When I've gone partially down distance, I flip the board over and repeat the process from the other side. You see the line has split there, so I've not chiselled all the way along. I'd rather remove this material and then neaten up the depth of the cut later. Like so. This wood is quite brittle in its current state and is prone to splitting, so I'm being very careful and taking off very small amounts. Now that there's no resistance, I'm actually cutting down along the knife mark. I'll keep flipping the board and coming in from either side until I'm happy with the finish. Once I'm nearly there, I can freehand the chisel to pare off any remaining fibres. It's essential to have a nice sharp chisel to do this kind of thing. The socket is nearly finished, so I place the piece in the vise just to tidy it up. So now it's time to check the fit. I can see already it's going to be too small, so using a mallet I tap the piece in lightly so I can mark up where I need to remove some more material. Using the chisel I can then pare down along this line. This is why I tend to make joints nice and tight to start with. It's always possible to remove material to make something fit, but if you've cut it too big in the first place, there's nothing much you can do and you're going to have a sloppy joint. I'm just checking here that it's neat right down into the corners. And let's try it again. That's a much better fit. After cutting the other socket in the first end, I'll do a quick dry assembly to see how things are progressing. The finished piece is going to be something like this. So I cut the sockets in the other end and we're getting quite close now. Next we need to sort out the bottom rail. To fit the bottom rail, I'm going to cut a housing joint into the inside of each edge. I'll cut the housing depth so that it is about half the thickness of the end piece. So I'll line up one end of the bottom rail against the shoulder of the side pieces and mark in that length. I'll then add the thickness of the side piece and this will give me the length I need for the bottom rail. I'll make that mark more precise by using my square. And then using my knife. I can then trace this onto the front of the board to mark in where I need to cut. Because this is a cross cut, I'll chisel into the knife mark to help start the saw. I'll then cut the board to length using a tenon saw. The bottom rail is going to be positioned something like this. I'm going to inset it about 1/2 inch from the bottom. To mark this up, I use my mortise gauge. I set the 2 pins to the thickness of the bottom rail, and then set the distance between the fence and the bottom pin to my required distance from the bottom of the end piece. I can then score in the bottom and top edges of the mortise simultaneously. Using a ruler and knife, I'll make those gauge lines a little bit deeper. I'm going to be chiselling out this material, so I want these lines to be as crisp as possible, and to run a little deeper than the mortise gauge itself will allow. Using my knife and a square, I mark in the end of the mortise. Next, I need to remove this waste material using the chisel. I do this by choking upon the chisel and making a series of shallow chops across the length of the mortise. I'm sorry the camera work is a little bit bad here and all you've actually got is a shot of my elbow. That's a little bit better. After making the chops, I can flake away some of the waste material. I really do apologise for the camera work here. As you can see here, I've just chipped out part of the bottom edge. I'm going to fix that later. I keep chopping across the mortise to make it deeper. Here's that chip. I'm going to remove it for now and put it to one side so I can fix it later. Using my knife and a ruler, I score in the edges of the mortise so I can run deeper with the chisel and try and avoid any more chip out. I'll then continue to chop out the mortise until it's down to the desired depth. Now to do something about that chip. This kind of thing is easily fixed. First I'll apply some CS glue, also known as super glue. I then press the chip into place. I'll temporarily hold it in position with a piece of paper tape and then spray on some activator to make the glue cure quicker. I can then peel away the tape and the chip is nicely fixed. To make the planter more interesting, I decided to make a carving into one of the ends. The person I'm making this for is a big fan of lilies, and so I'm going to carve a lily design into this end. I've printed off a simple design. And I'm going to position it something like this. I sprayed the reverse of my template with some spray mount. Stick it in position and smooth it out with a paper towel. I then clamp the workpiece to my bench. I'm going to use this parting tool with a 45-degree V-shape in order to do the carving. It's very sharp, so all I do is put the tool at a slight angle and then follow the lines of my design, gently tapping with the mallet as I go. It doesn't require a lot of force. I just take time to adjust my body position to make sure that I'm always chopping in the right direction. It's quite an enjoyable pursuit, and you can't go too far wrong as long as you use gentle tapping and don't try and force the chisel faster than it wants to go. By adjusting the angle between the cutting tool and the board, you can make different depths of cut. When I've cut the main outline, I can gouge out the more subtle details by just pushing the parting tool into the wood freehand. And once finished, I can scrape off the design using a card scraper. And I wipe over with thinners to remove any remaining stickiness. To make the design more obvious, I'm going to paint the carving with this acrylic paint. I just take a small brush and paint along the carving. I want to ensure that I get the paint in all the internal surfaces of the carving. I don't worry too much about getting paint on the surface of the board, as this will be removed in the next step. When the paint has dried, I sand the surface of the board to remove any paint which has escaped from the carving. I had actually dislocated my shoulder about a week before finishing off this project, so I used this power sander because my arm muscles were in quite a bit of pain. The original table that this wood came from was sold as teak-style outdoor furniture. In fact, I think the wood is probably Iroko, which is notorious as being an irritant. My dad was certainly allergic to it and it caused breathing problems for him, so I'm taking no chances and wearing a mask and eye protection when doing any sanding. I do some final sanding before putting everything together. I don't need to do much because I planed everything up nicely. I do one last dry assembly to make sure everything fits together properly. And then I start the glue up. I start by adding glue to all the mating surfaces, the inside of the mortises and the dovetail sockets. And then I start fitting everything together. It's quite a fiddly job because of the angles. And quite often as I got one joint in, the other one popped out. But once the dovetails were in, it started pulling everything together nicely. I added some clamps and left the glue to cure. Once set, I remove the clamps and we can start to see what the finished piece is like. You can probably see that the dovetails at the front end are protruding quite a bit. And I'll just cut them off here with a flush saw. This happened because I ran into some bad wood while I was cutting the shoulders, so I had to cut the dovetail slightly deeper than originally anticipated. Anyway, it's a quick fix. I then plane all 4 dovetail ends. This gets them nice and flush with the surface. I make a few passes with the plane over the end to make sure that the sides are completely flush with the side of the end piece. I'm not taking very much off here at all, the plane has a very shallow set. I do some final sanding to remove any stubborn bits of glue, and also to round over all the edges to make it more comfortable to handle. I do this just by taking the corner off each of the straight pieces so they're nice and rounded. To round over the front and back edge, I'm going to use a hand router with a rounded bit. I just trace around the outside edge of each end. I usually do this kind of thing with the block plane, but again my arm was still giving me some pain from the dislocation. And that all feels pretty nice. A quick inspection and then it's ready to finish. I'm going to finish this using T-coil. This is very hardy wood and great for outdoor furniture, and the T-coil will just help to protect it even more. It also gives the wood this nice deep rich colour. I put plenty of oil on, it will soak away quite quickly, especially into the end grain. I gave it about 3 coats in total, leaving a day or so for each coat to soak in. And I really think it's looking quite nice. I did have a concern that if the planter was stood outside, then there might be a wicking effect in the end grain drawing water up into it, so I decided to find some method to keep it off the floor, and I found these. These are actually sold as sliders for shelves, but I think they're a perfect solution for the job in hand. So first of all, I mark in the centre of each of the end pieces, and then mark in an equal distance from each end. Then I simply hammer them into position. In some varieties of wood I might have drilled pilot holes for the nails, but I didn't have any worries about splitting here. They make perfect feet. And there's a finished piece. And the plant pots go in like that. I'm quite pleased with the end result and glad I could do something useful with the salvaged wood. And here it is along with the seed packets we provided as part of the gift. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please click like. Check out our channel and please subscribe to keep up to date with new project videos.